Batumi is by all accounts a lovely place. It's the second largest city in Georgia. The country, not the state, sits right on the coast of the Black Sea. Batumi has a fairly famous botanical garden, has a few historic churches and mosques, it has miles of beaches. Also history, Stalin lived in Batumi. Stalin both lived in Batumi and briefly went to prison there at the turn of the 20th century. Hey, how about that? Once upon a time, more recently, there was going to be a big luxury development there, more than 500,000 square feet of developed space, including a marina, a park, a yacht club, a hotel, more than a dozen other buildings, and at the center of all of it, a big, pokey 44-story residential tower, a Trump Tower Batumi, which never happened. President-elect Trump pulled out of the Trump Tower Batumi deal just days before the inauguration. Former partners in that deal told Forbes magazine last year that to try to keep the deal alive, they might try to put up what amounts to a fake Trump Tower at the center of that site, kind of an ersatz Trump Tower. Maybe instead of a Trump Tower, it could be a Trump Tower or a Frump Tower. See if anybody notices. That is a funny thing to imagine. It would be even funnier if they pulled it off. But the special counsel's office has reportedly been interested in Trump Organization deals in that part of the world, in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union. That was first reported this spring by McClatchy. And now tonight there's a whole new wrinkle, because the president's favorite architect, who, among other things, designed the $250 million would-be metropolis on that Black Sea coast, the architect has, for all intents and purposes, gone off the grid. A CNBC reporter tried to inquire with this architect about his work on Trump deals in Eastern Europe. And upon being contacted by a reporter for CNBC, the architect disappeared in a poof of smoke. Mr. Fotiadis, his name is Fotiadis, quote, did not respond to a call or an email, but 8 hours later, he announced on Twitter that he was closing his firm, John Fotiadis Architect, or JFA, after 10 years in business. A few days later, Mr. Fotiadis closed the Twitter account he had used to announce he was closing down his firm. By the end of the week, all the contents from his professional website, including his international architecture portfolio, had been removed. Also gone was reference to the 2 overseas branches of his firm that he had opened in Georgia and in Ukraine. Mr. Fotiadis has not answered repeated calls, emails, or text messages from CNBC with questions about his work in Eurasia or why he shuttered his company. He's also declining to comment on whether he has been approached by anybody from Robert Mueller's office. What was that about? You get a call from CNBC and you immediately shut down your architecture firm, disappear off Twitter, remove all vestiges of your professional career from the web, and stop answering your phone? Why the rush? What's going on? Joining us now is Christina Wilkie, White House reporter for CNBC.com. She's the one who spooked the architect. Christina, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Do you have this effect on people more broadly?
I do not. People love to call me back.
So let me just ask, if this is very unusual. Obviously, when you call, we all know, you call somebody, you ask them pointed questions, sometimes they make themselves scarce. This seems like he's going to great extremes.
Yes, and architects I spoke to said it was extreme. They'd never seen a firm shut down so quickly. People change jobs, but the idea that that immediately a firm would announce it was closing after 10 years. Also, an architect lives by their portfolio. So the idea that he would have removed more than 30 projects from his public portfolio is, they just said they'd never seen anything like it.
Now, there's no suggestion that he's in trouble. We don't have any indication. Your reporting suggests that there's no reason that he's come under suspicion for any wrongdoing.
No.
Has there been any other reporting as to his involvement potentially with the investigation or potentially involvement in overseas investigations? We know that in Ukraine, for example, prosecutors have looked into possible money laundering and other misdealings around corruption in real estate deals. Has he been caught up in any of that?
Not that we know of.
Wow.
He basically, over the past 2 years, as we have looked all over the world for pieces of this Trump story, he's remained a figure kind of in the shadows, perhaps partly of his own choosing, but certainly now he's a guy who doesn't want to be found. But what I have reported out is that he was present in a ton of very interesting moments in Trump's career, especially in Eastern Europe.
Now, Mr. Fotiadis is an architect. He's an American. He did open offices both in Ukraine and in Georgia?
Yes, he did.
Okay, so did his work over time shift to become basically a former Soviet states-based firm?
His firm remained in New York, but he opened these 2 branches. The majority of his work during this period from about 2007 to 2013, 2014 was mostly in Eastern Europe. He had clients in Ukraine, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, in Georgia. He had big clients, so that the richest man in Ukraine was one of his big patrons, the same man who brought Paul Manafort actually to Ukraine.
That's one of the unusual overlaps here, right?
Yes,
I mean, there's been a lot of questions as to how Donald Trump and Paul Manafort ever ended up getting together, why their circles overlapped. Right. One of the ways in which they overlap is this guy who was doing all these buildings for Trump ended up also doing buildings for the guy who was funding Paul Manafort's work in Ukraine.
Yes, this is a way that they overlap. We have no indication that Fotiadis and Paul Manafort would have overlapped. Often these oligarchs, they keep their worlds very compartmentalized. So the idea that your architect would interact with your political consultant, experts said that was unlikely. But this architect, he shows up, then he's doing Trump's projects in Batumi. He did a Trump project in Florida that was never built. He did designed Trump Astana's Kazakhstan tower, and what we found was really that there was this 3-legged stool. When Trump would go into these Eastern European licensing deals, it would be Trump the salesman, it would be Michael Cohen the lawyer, and it would be Fotiadis the architect. And in order to get these licensing deals and to seal it, Trump needed to bring an architect with him so that there was something to sell, and a lawyer so that they could sign the deal right there. But so this was part of Trump's power play.
That's fascinating. So to the extent that Trump's business deals, particularly in the former Soviet Union, are of interest in terms of the Russia investigation, he's the third part of it. Michael Cohen under criminal investigation, President Trump, obviously the subject of this inquiry by the special counsel's office. The other guy who was in the room for all those discussions disappeared when you called him.
He did.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay. Well, good luck finding him.
Thank you.
If he calls you back, please call me after.
I will.
Christina Walecki, White House reporter for CNBC.com. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thanks.
All right. We'll be right back. Lots to come tonight. We just got a breaking news story that is just posted at the New York Times that I want to share with you and get some expert advice on, because I'm not sure that I get the full picture of this, but this is just breaking, and the one thing I do get about this is that this is a big deal. Late last night, you might have seen the news that the Senate had passed a unanimous resolution that was very mysterious. It raised lots of eyebrows, really nobody knew what it was about. It was a resolution that would allow the Intelligence Committee in the Senate to hand over information from the Senate to the Justice Department. And we had no idea what that was about and why they'd passed this unanimous resolution, but it said that it was what they needed to hand over was documents that were in connection with some sort of pending investigation arising out of the unauthorized disclosure of information. Okay, so there's been an unauthorized disclosure of information. The Senate has information about it. The Justice Department wants that information. The Senate is now approving, handing that information over so the Justice Department can act on it. What is all that about? Then later on tonight, we started to get reporting from multiple sources that the unauthorized disclosure of information was from somebody who had been a longtime staffer on the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. The Senate and House Intelligence Committees obviously handle incredibly sensitive material under incredibly rigorous secrecy protocols. And being a longtime staffer, according to the Wall Street Journal, it was a 31-year staffer who had served in a nonpartisan capacity under multiple administrations and under different majorities. This Senate Intelligence Committee staffer was reportedly being investigated by the Justice Department for unauthorized disclosure of information. That's what we had as of last night in this sort of reporting that was bubbling up through the day. Well, now we've got a very unexpected turn in this from the New York Times. I think we got the headline here. Yeah, here it is. Justice Department seizes New York Times reporters' email and phone records in leak investigation. Quoting from the Times, federal law enforcement officials secretly seized years' worth of a New York Times reporter's phone and email records this year in an investigation of classified information leaks. Now, this reporter having records seized, this is the same story apparently on that news that we got last night and into today about something being leaked by a staffer on the Senate Intelligence Committee. This reporter who had her phone and email records seized unbeknownst to her, a reporter named Allie Watkins, who now works for the Times. She previously worked for BuzzFeed. She previously worked for Politico. Again, now she works for the Times, and she did not know, I guess until recently, that the Justice Department had seized her records, her phone and email records. That's a big deal for anybody. It's a really big deal, and it has really big First Amendment implications if they do this to a reporter. Continuing from the Times, quote, shortly before she began working at the Times, FBI agents approached the reporter, Allie Watkins, seeking information about a previous 3-year romantic relationship she had had with James A. Wolfe, the Senate Intelligence Committee's former director of security. The FBI agents said they were investigating unauthorized leaks. Ms. Watkins did not answer the agents' questions. Mr. Wolfe stopped performing committee work in December. He retired from the committee in May, meaning last month. Mr. Wolfe was not a source of information for Ms. Watkins during their relationship, she said. She says that she told editors at BuzzFeed News and Politico about it and continued to cover national security, including the committee's work. Ms. Watkins also told editors at the Times about the previous relationship when she was hired to cover federal law enforcement. So again, the full scope of this is as yet unclear. This is just breaking in the New York Times. We've got two big deals here. We've got the Senate with this unanimous resolution saying, yeah, the Intelligence Committee can give information to law enforcement as law enforcement investigates potential leaks by a staffer on the Intelligence Committee, a longtime senior staffer on intelligence. We now have the name of that staffer and the news that he is now retired. But apparently, at least according to this reporting in the Times, there is a suggestion that his previous 3-year-long relationship with a reporter, a national security reporter, led to the Justice Department surveilling a reporter's email and phone records, unbeknownst to her, for years while she was reporting on serious national security matters for a number of different U.S. publications. Reporters do not expect that to happen to them in this country. Joining us now is Matt Miller, former Justice Department spokesman under Eric Holder. Mr. Miller, thank you for joining us on short notice. We called you when we saw this, and I know you've only had as much time to digest it as I have. Thanks very much for being with us.
Of course.
The Times notes in the second paragraph of the story that under President Barack Obama, there had been aggressive tactics to crack down on leaks, including tactics that made some reporters uncomfortable and some news organizations unhappy with the way that reporters were pursued, essentially, in order to track down leaks. Is this a continuation of that, or is this a departure?
It is a continuation of what happened early in the Obama administration. Basically exactly what the Justice Department has done here. It did to one of the reporters who wrote this story, Adam Goldman, and also MADDOW, then with the AP, now, of course, with the New York Times. But something important happened after the Justice Department did that. Under Eric Holder, who was then the Attorney General, the department recognized that basically they had gone too far and put in place a series of regulations that are supposed to prevent this from happening without the Justice Department going to the media organization and trying to negotiate some sort of accommodation in advance. And it is obvious that that didn't happen in this case. What's supposed to happen under these new regulations is that the Justice Department, before it subpoenas a reporter's information, because this is important, this is different from subpoenaing a reporter's testimony. The reporter doesn't know if you've gone and gotten their emails or gone and gotten their phone records. They have no ability to go to court to try to block it. The Justice Department under Holder put in place new regulations that would allow for some kind of negotiation between the media outlet and the Justice Department, and give the media outlet the opportunity to go to court to try to block the Justice Department from seizing these records. It appears that in this case, DOJ did not do that. They did not follow those regulations.
Now, Matt, the other entity that is implicated in this story and involved in what is still obviously a developing story is the Intelligence Committee. This longtime staffer from the Intelligence Committee who's reportedly under investigation for unauthorized disclosure of information, he's the security director at the Intelligence Committee. And as far as I understand it, that means that he would have been responsible on the Intelligence Committee for making sure that classified information and secret information was closely and appropriately held. Under that circumstance, if he was involved in any unauthorized disclosure of information, particularly from that very important perch, is that the sort of thing that Congress would police itself, or would you expect that the Justice Department will get involved in that as a potentially criminal matter?
This raises really important kind of constitutional questions between the two branches. You've seen before where the Justice Department has tried to investigate leaks from Congress, and Congress has been very resistant about turning over information to the Justice Department. I think one of the things we don't know here is what leaks the Justice Department is investigating, and this really is important because there are leaks, I would argue, that are important leaks that do compromise national security that should be investigated, and at times people should be prosecuted for those leaks. But then there are other leaks that just embarrass the administration. They're not leaks that actually compromise national security, but they embarrass the president. And we know that President Trump has been outraged by some of those leaks. He's been outraged by leaks of conversations he's had with foreign leaders. And he's wanted the Justice Department to go after the people who are responsible for those leaks and hold them accountable. So I think we still need to know what this leak was before we are able to answer, is this an appropriate investigation? I'm leaving aside whether some of these tactics are appropriate or not, but whether the investigation itself is appropriate or whether it looks like retaliation. One
last question for you, Matt. If, as you say, under Attorney General Eric Holder, there were new regulations put in place so that reporters would be protected from intrusive searches like this, basically as a way of protecting the freedom of the press. There would be, as you described, there'd have to be some sort of accommodation. There'd have to be some sort of negotiation with a media outlet or a reporter before a reporter was surveilled in this way as part of a leak investigation. I've got my control room needs to stop talking in my ear for a second. Thank you very much. Sorry, Matt. I had two people talking to me at the same time I was trying to talk to you. At the same time, if Holder put in those rules, obviously we have a different Attorney General now. If this was done in violation of DOJ policies, if this New York Times reporter was surveilled inappropriately, how is that policed within the Justice Department?
It would have to be policed by the Inspector General. There is a kind of loophole that the Attorney General can use if they determine that, I think the regulations say that, if negotiations with the media outlet would pose a substantial threat to the investigation, if it would harm national security, the Attorney General can essentially, suspend that negotiation or, not negotiate with the media outlet. It's hard to see how, in this case, just looking from the outside, that would be applicable here. It's something that would be policed by the Inspector General, but ultimately these are regulations that are put in place by the Attorney General. They can be rescinded by the Attorney General. Attorney General Sessions and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein announced early on that they were going to look at these regulations and decide whether they ought to be withdrawn. They haven't officially withdrawn them, so they are still in place, but we know that they've been skeptical of them, and we know that they've talked about cracking down more on leaks than has happened in the past. So we don't know exactly how they decided to make this decision to subpoena, reporters, or whether they suspended these or whether they essentially, invoke this kind of loophole in the regulation to justify the subpoena. I think that's a very important question.
Matt Miller, former Justice Department spokesperson, joining us on short notice tonight. Much appreciated, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, we're absorbing this new information just reported from the New York Times. We had seen some intrigue coming in the Senate around a potential investigation that involved the Senate handing over information to the Justice Department about some unauthorized disclosure of information by a staffer on the Senate Intelligence Committee. That was intriguing enough heading into this night's broadcast. But then as soon as we got on the air, the New York Times posted this report that the Justice Department has been secretly seizing and surveilling records, phone records, and email records from one of their national security reporters. It is reportedly related to this investigation, but this is a big deal in terms of freedom of the press. We'll have much more to come tonight. Stay with us.
Much for joining us.
Thank you.
That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
You will pry the Ritz-Carlton lotion scandal from
Ritz-Carlton lotion. He's driving around because he went to a Ritz-Carlton once. He likes the lotion, and so he's got his government employee trying to get that the moment, the nostalgic moment he's seeking to recreate of the smell of the Ritz-Carlton lotion. It's
Here's
perfect.
the thing.
Very human.
Here's the thing that I don't understand about it, honestly. If you got the lotion at the Ritz-Carlton, presumably that means it's like like the Ritz-Carlton lotion.
Yeah.
Why do you have to drive around looking for it? Don't you just drive to the Ritz-Carlton?
That's great. He's like, go to the W Hotel, and he's like, they don't have it.
I know.
It's like, no, they don't have it. It's the Ritz-Carlton lotion.
Exactly. Like the one thing we know about Ritz-Carlton lotion is where to get it. Right?
It's true.
Anyway, thank you, my
I hope
friend.
he's watching. Okay.
Much appreciated. All right. Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Super happy to have you here. When you ask questions, it turns out, when things that previously have been done in the dark are forced into the light, that makes stuff happen. There's something about the effect of sunlight. There's something about the public disclosure of previously secret maneuverings that makes stuff happen, that sets things in motion. You know, you turn on the light. You ever lived in an apartment or a house that like had bugs? I had once was renting an apartment in San Francisco, and I had signed the contract. Like I was ready to move in, and I brought over a friend of mine because I was so excited about this new apartment, and I brought my friend over, and I was like, let's, get some burritos, and I'll go over, and we haven't moved in yet, but I signed the contract. We're going to move in the next few days. I'll show you the place. We walked in. It was nighttime. Flipped on the light. Roaches. And they ran for the corners. And I got out of that contract, and I did not move into that apartment. But my friend never wanted to go anywhere to eat dinner with me again. And I learned about that old anecdote that, you flip on the lights and stuff scatters. That works in the news too. And we keep seeing that dynamic again and again of people flipping on the switch and the bugs scattering. And in today's news, it has really become one of the most interesting things that has happened yet in this whole scandal. I'll tell you about how the dynamic's been working. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had this startling revelation in the New York Times that related to one of the people who is a cooperating witness in the special counsel's investigation. He's actually the only person we know of who has been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation with Robert Mueller and the special counsel's office. His name is George Nader. He has multiple criminal convictions in multiple countries, including for child pornography and child molestation. But he has nevertheless turned up multiple times in the Trump White House. He's turned up in this photo with Donald Trump. And he turns up again and again and again in Trump Tower and interacting with Trump campaign officials in meetings that would later come under scrutiny by the special counsel's office as the special counsel looks at links between the Trump campaign and Russia's attack on the 2016 election. So a couple of weeks ago, we learned in the New York Times that that guy, George Nader, was in attendance at a previously unreported meeting that happened at Trump Tower in New York 3 months before the 2016 election. At that meeting, according to the Times' reporting, a foreign company pitched the Trump campaign on what would be a foreign-funded social media manipulation campaign, which they were offering to mount in the United States in order to help Trump win the election. So that was a fascinating, obviously very troubling revelation. Any effort like that, of course, would be illegal on a whole bunch of different grounds. It would be a foreign expenditure, using foreign workers to manipulate the American electorate somehow in ways to benefit a U.S. presidential candidate with the knowledge of the U.S. presidential candidate, since that was his campaign being pitched on this proposal. So it was amazing reporting by the Times, very disturbing revelation. The name of the company that reportedly pitched that seemingly illegal plan to the Trump campaign 3 months before the election was a company called Psy Group, P-S-Y, Psy Group. But it's interesting, by the time we read the name of that company in the New York Times, by the time we learned about that scheme in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago, the Psy Group was long gone. Apparently, agents working for the special counsel's office in February had stopped the founder of that firm, the guy who'd been at that meeting supposedly pitching that plan to the Trump campaign. They stopped him at an airport in Washington, D.C. They questioned him and, quote, briefly seized his electronic devices. They later brought him before the grand jury. And that attention, those questions to that businessman about whatever he was doing with that firm, those questions had consequences. He got stopped in February. They checked his electronic devices. They brought him before the grand jury. Simultaneously, FBI agents working with Mueller's team turned up at the Psy Group, turned up at the firm and started talking to employees. Mueller also reportedly subpoenaed bank records for the firm. And you push that stuff out into the light, you start asking those questions, it makes stuff happen. What did the firm do right after those approaches from the special counsel's office? They decided that they would disappear. February 25th, the firm's CEO informs its employees that the company is disappearing. It will be shutting down. So by the time that whole new part of the Mueller investigation that we didn't know about before, by the time it made it into the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, the Times was only able to report that that company is, quote, in liquidation. Yeah, Mueller started asking around, they decided to disappear. You start asking questions, stuff happens, right? Things get forced into the light, stuff happens. This week, we learned that it had happened again in a very similar fashion, but with a different foreign firm. This time it was Cambridge Analytica, which was the data firm that was hired by the Trump campaign. They've since gotten themselves into a million different kinds of trouble. Last year, we learned that Mueller's investigators had started looking at Cambridge Analytica. They'd asked the firm to hand over communications, hand over emails from their employees. The Wall Street Journal reported that Cambridge Analytica had been in touch with WikiLeaks, offering help in distributing Democratic documents during the campaign that had been stolen by Russia. Well, in March of this year, reporters started tracking down yet another scandal about the firm. The story of the firm using its own stolen data. Tens of millions of private profiles that they stole off Facebook without consent and used to build basically the spine of their operation as a company. Reporters started asking around about that in March. Well, this week, the Financial Times in Britain reports that those questions that reporters were asking about that scandal, those questions caused two things to happen at that firm. Number one, according to the Financial Times, those questions from reporters about that data scandal caused the Cambridge Analytica CEO to withdraw $8 million in cash from the company and to take it home. And number two, that started the process of the company starting to disappear. The company does still appear to be in trouble. The CEO appears to still be in trouble. The questions of what exactly that company did for the Trump campaign and whether it was part of a foreign influence operation, those remain open questions in terms of the Mueller investigation. But reporters pressing that firm on those questions appear to have caused that firm to disappear. Cambridge Analytica shut itself down. They technically no longer exist. We see this dynamic again and again with all these mysterious entities that have been operating in the dark. Somebody walks into the room, flips on the light switch, things change. When they get pushed into the light, when people start asking questions, stuff happens. Today, we obtained the transcript of a court hearing that took place yesterday in federal court in New York City. It's a court case involving Elliot Broidy, deputy finance chair of the RNC until recently, when he resigned in a sketchy hush money scandal that supposedly involved him paying off a mistress who got pregnant. But oddly, for that transaction, Mr. Broidy chose to use Donald Trump's hush money to the mistress lawyer, as well as Donald Trump's other hush money to the mistress lawyer. And he also used Donald Trump's pseudonym, Donald Trump's own pseudonym from his other hush money to the mistress cases. Why was Elliot Broidy using all Donald Trump's stuff for his own mistress case? Then as soon as anybody inquired about this unusual, very Donald Trump-like mistress hush money deal, Mr. Broidy issued an over-the-top mea culpa. He came clean about everything, and he instantly resigned from the RNC. Someday we will finally figure out what actually happened there, and it's going to be an amazing story. I will tell you, it is not, that particular one is not an amazing story that I'm looking forward to seeing the movie of. That's one I would prefer to read in print. But someday we will get that full story. And Elliot Broidy's troubles extend well beyond that literally unbelievable mistress controversy, which supposedly is what ended his time as the deputy finance chairman of the National Republican Party. Mr. Broidy was also the business partner of George Nader, who is that cooperating witness in the Mueller investigation, the one who's cooperating in exchange for immunity. Mr. Broidy is also caught up in a number of different scandals involving alleged influence peddling on behalf of foreign interests, including clients in Malaysia and in United Arab Emirates and in other countries. As part of that drama in federal court yesterday, a judge ordered effectively the disclosure to the court of who the nation of Qatar secretly had working for them in this country. And that ruling yesterday in federal court in New York led to this dramatic headline today at Politico. Key figures sever ties with Qatar. It's also led at least one American who's caught up in the scandal about unregistered foreign agents involving Elliot Brody. It's caused at least one American to announce today that whatever work he might have done with Qatar before, he's not doing it anymore. And by the way, on Friday, he's going to retroactively register as a foreign agent. So what's the overall story with these other flows of foreign money involving these Gulf states? And the Mueller investigation looking into that, what's the relationship between this cascade of Elliot Brody scandals and the cooperation of Elliot Brody's business partner with the Mueller investigation? And we don't know yet. We don't have the answers to those questions yet. But asking questions about it, forcing this stuff into the light, is making stuff happen. We got this amazing statement tonight from Joey Elaham, who is the guy who's being forced out into the open by the court in terms of his relationship with Qatar. Thanks to this Elliot Brody lawsuit, Mr. Elaham told us tonight, quote, "So I don't know if I ever was a so-called legal agent of Qatar, but I do know that as of Friday, I'm not anything with them." As of Friday, he will retroactively have had nothing to do with them. He will also register as their foreign agent. Now, Mr. Elaham also tells us tonight that his sudden abandonment of Qatar has nothing to do at all with that court hearing yesterday. But the judge yesterday did order him to respond to a subpoena in this case. And when you ask questions, stuff happens. When stuff is forced into the light, stuff happens. When courts force the disclosure of previously secret dynamics, stuff happens. And we have seen this over and over and over again in Trump administration scandals. I mean, talk about hush money. It randomly was the Stormy Daniels hush money lawsuit that brought about the exposure of all those mysterious payments that had been made to President Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. Those mysterious payments to Michael Cohen from all sorts of unexpected sources. It was the Stormy Daniels lawsuit that showed us how the pharmaceutical firm Novartis and how the giant telecom firm AT&T had apparently put Michael Cohen on their corporate payrolls to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars a month. And they were apparently quite happy to have him on the payroll, right up until the moment that those payments got exposed because of the Stormy Daniels lawsuit. That exposure to the light suddenly made Novartis Pharmaceuticals and AT&T both decide that those payments to Michael Cohen had been a mistake. The public exposure of those payments led AT&T to fire their chief lobbyist, led Novartis to fire their general counsel. None of that would have happened had that not been pushed out into the light. They had Michael Cohen on the payroll. It wasn't a secret to them. It's only when it stopped being a secret to us that all of a sudden they decided it was a bad idea and that people had to go. We see this dynamic at work over and over again and on almost every element of the scandals that swirl around this administration and this president. But now tonight, it is maybe my most favorite one yet. I mean, we've seen all along. Reporters start asking questions, FBI agents start asking questions. When it starts to look like things are going to get exposed in court, all of a sudden, people change. You know, people realize they need to register as a foreign agent. People separate themselves from countries they used to work for. Whole companies disappear into thin air. Corporations that can't really disappear into thin air suddenly decide to become much more critical of their own behavior they didn't previously see as a problem. They start firing their executives to try to make the problem go away, to try to make themselves look like they recognize their mistake. Well, the latest iteration of this dynamic in the era of Trump administration scandals, the latest one that's just happened today, may be like the apex example of that dynamic at work. This is courtesy of reporter Christina Wilkie at CNBC. Quote, as Robert Mueller looks ever more closely at President Donald Trump's foreign business ties, one former associate has remained outside the spotlight despite playing a key role in Trump's quest for real estate deals in the former Soviet Union. Architect John Fotiadis designed some of Trump's most ambitious luxury developments there. Fotiadis' work offers a window into Trump's dealings in the complex, opaque world of Eurasian real estate. Today, several of these projects are reportedly under scrutiny by the special counsel, who's investigating Russian meddling in the 2016 election and any means by which Moscow might have exerted influence over Trump or his campaign, including through business deals. After McClatchy reported in April that Mueller's probe was looking more closely at people involved in Trump's business dealings in Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Russia, and after CNBC received a tip that architect Fodiatis had worked on several Trump projects in Eurasia, CNBC reached out to Mr. Fodiatis on April 11th for comment about his work. This is the amazing part. Are you ready? So they reach out to him on April 11th. Quote, Fodiatis did not respond to a call or to an email, but 8 hours later, he announced on Twitter that he was closing his architecture firm after 10 years in business. A few days later, he closed down the Twitter account that he had used to announce that he was closing down his architecture firm. By the end of the week, all the content from his professional website, including his entire international architecture portfolio, had been removed from the web. Also gone was any reference to the 2 overseas branches of his architectural firm that he had opened in Georgia and in Ukraine. Mr. Fodiatis has still not answered repeated calls, emails, or text messages from CNBC with questions about his work in Eurasia or about why he so suddenly shuttered his company. He's also declined comment on whether he has been contacted by anyone from Robert Mueller's office. Investigators asking questions, judges demanding disclosure, reporters poking around, looking at stuff, looking stuff up, being nosy, following leads, making calls. That's what makes the world go round. That's what makes my world go round, at least. I mean, those things can cause amazing stuff to happen in the world. But to make an entire architectural firm disappear with one phone call, that is an amazing trick. CNBC just disappeared Donald Trump's longtime architect and his entire international architecture firm with a single phone call. That's a trick. That reporter joins us here next.